welcome Amrita Banerjee from IIT Bombay to deliver this third talk in the Anamani lecture series. And as you know, this series actually is an initiative of the Working Group for Gender Equity, WGGE, of the Astronomical Society of India. And Sushant Kunad and Neeraj Mohan, who's not here right now, were the first people who started and who named the series after Anamani. So, and I also acknowledge the women's cell of NCRA for organizing this talk. So I'll just say a little bit about Anamani, and after whom this lecture series is named. So she was a pioneering Indian physicist and a meteorologist, and she carried out a lot of path-breaking research in the 1950s, India, against all odds. So she completed her undergraduate degree in physics from Presidency College in Madras, and she undertook research at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. She worked in C V Raman's lab, and there she started her PhD basically doing the spectroscopy of diamonds and rubies, and she published 5 single author papers for her PhD. But after that, Madras University refused to actually give her PhD degree because she didn't actually have a formal master's degree. But somehow that had not stopped her from actually starting the PhD itself, because she was accepted at IISc on the basis of her undergraduate degree. So after that, she basically took up an internship to study physics in Imperial College, London. But then finally she ended up working on something different, which is meteorological instrumentation. So she returned to India in 1948 and she joined the Indian Meterological Department, IMD, at Pune. And she retired in 1976 as the Deputy Director General of IMD. And then she returned and spent several years at the Raman Research Institute as a visiting professor. So during her career, in spite of being a meteorologist, she actually did a lot of physics work, including setting up instruments to study the ozone layer and wind energy. And then she actually helped build a millimeter wave telescope at Nandi Hills to study solar radiation. And she's published 2 books on solar radiation in India. Okay, so now our speaker today, Dr. Amrita Banerjee. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Bombay. She received a PhD in philosophy and a graduate certificate in women's and gender studies from the University of Oregon, USA. She held the position of assistant professor of philosophy at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania before she took up a position at IIT Bombay. Dr. Banerjee specializes in moral and political philosophy, which she approaches from the traditions of feminist philosophy and classical pragmatism. And she pays special attention to marginalized intellectual spaces within philosophy, and especially work by women philosophers and philosophers of color. So today, Dr. Banerjee is going to speak on a new conceptual model of diversity, philosophical reflections on exclusion in academia. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Amrita Banerjee to deliver this talk.
Thank you so much for the invitation and this wonderful initiative. I hope the Indian Council of Philosophical Research can replicate this initiative as well. And I feel really honored to give a talk named after one of India's early women academics. So today, as Preeti said, that I work in moral and political philosophy. Moral philosophy basically focuses on the area of ethics. So we talk about values, standards, right and wrong, etc. And political philosophy focuses on concepts such as state, justice, oppression, privilege, things like that. So this is the kind of intersection that I work with. And in some ways, I have been pushed into thinking about diversity as an outcome of inhabiting space in philosophy, and especially working in the Western tradition, which happens to be dominated our philosophical canon is dominated by white male thinkers, even when philosophy is taught or done in the Indian context. And in Indian philosophy also, we have generally, we learn texts and writings by male philosophers. So in my undergraduate from Presidency College, Calcutta, and masters from Jadavpur University, we actually had no women philosopher on the syllabus. So it's quite a task if one is in philosophy to actually go locate these sorts of thinkers and traditions. And that kind of pushed me into thinking on some of the concepts that I will present to you today. So I go through, so I will basically interrogate the concept diversity itself. But before that, I just want to show a few sort of, few points. And of course, there is enough statistics that we can find now and sociological data that's also there. But one of the ways in which the exclusion shows up in academia are some of these matrices, and some of these are better studied than others. So for instance, the gender matrix is better studied in the US context than the race matrix or the ability status, these sorts of things. And one of the very interesting, and this is data from 2009, which I'm sorry for this got very condensed, but this shows the percentage of PhDs earned by women in 2009 in the US. And it's spread across disciplines, and you can see how there's physics and philosophy does pretty poorly on the scale, right?
Do you want to use a pointer? There's
Yeah.
a pointer there.
Yeah.
Is it on?
So yeah, it's on. This one?
Yes.
So physics is right here. Then you have computer science, engineering, philosophy. Mathematics is surprisingly better. And then just on top of that, you have astrophysics, economics, chemistry, earth sciences, political science, history, statistics. This is across disciplines. And then you have decent representations in what goes up.
So, which is the discipline on top?
That's psychology. So you have psychology, which is the highest. Then English literature, anthropology, linguistics, sociology, molecular biology, neuroscience, classics, evolutionary biology, biochemistry, and then I think they've done a percentage across disciplines. And then you have statistics, history, political science, earth sciences, chemistry, economics, astronomy, astrophysics, mathematics, religious studies, philosophy, engineering, computer science, and physics. So in any case, there is what we see though is that there is a kind of problem of distribution across various disciplines, right? Some more than others, but and this is based on gender, but there are statistics that probably can be found along race and caste. Caste, I don't know how much it's studied in the Indian context relative to academia. Okay, so so when we try to understand potential spheres of exclusion, I think there are some nodes that are commonly looked at. For instance, what are the exit patterns? How many, at least in US universities, how many people are converting into majors? How many are then taking up the masters? And then how many after PhD are going into academics? Right, so what is the translation from student to active researchers? Right, so there are various exit points there. In philosophy, there have been studies, and you can tell me about physics, but APA, the American Philosophical Association, has done various studies about biased acceptance rates in journals, citation numbers of men and women scholars, and the representation of curriculum aspect. I already talked about how women philosophers are rarely represented in curricula on philosophy. But what is interesting, and philosophers have written and reflected on some of these nodes, about how, for instance, the ability to confidently identify as a practitioner of the discipline sometimes there are issues there, and that has come across when we talk about very famous women philosophers like Simone De Beauvoir or Hannah Arendt. Simone De Beauvoir throughout her life kept on saying that Jean-Paul Sartre is the philosopher and the writer. And one wonders why she says that, and one gets frustrated because she says that. Then you have Hannah Arendt who says that, one day there can be a male philosopher, but I'm a political theorist. So, of course, so these sorts of things are there, which are, so whether there is, and sometimes actually those literal sayings are taken to be ways to exclude these people from curriculum. That has been one of the problems, right? Then whether in philosophy, the other problem that is the case in the US at least is job placement by original discipline. By that I mean, for instance, you have a PhD in philosophy, but you are working on Latin American philosophy or African American philosophy. Chances are you would have to look or get a position in ethnic studies rather than in philosophy, because philosophy departments will not float tenure lines on these things. Indian philosophy will often get into religious studies. Feminist philosophers would often find a home in women's and gender studies. So this is, again, I don't know about other disciplines, but this is how it shows up in our disciplines a lot of times. So then these modes of exclusion is not simply about numbers, it's not simply about actual representation of people, but here you have people choosing to leave the discipline or being forced to leave, despite their training and desire to be there. So these actually, I think, pushes us to raise questions about disciplinary culture, ethics, and as well as methodologies pertaining to disciplines, right? What is the vetting process of some writing being considered to be philosophical versus not? So this is where some of the debates have happened in our discipline, as I'm sure has happened in others as well. So I think the question of diversity needs to be raised at both levels, at the level of academic institutions and professional bodies, when they talk about membership, student population, faculty ratios, things like that. But also, the question of diversity is a very important interdisciplinary matter. And I think as disciplines, we need to actually confront that as a kind of philosophical question. So, all these nodes of exclusion, one thing that has happened though, has made inclusion an agenda in a lot of universities' operational rhetoric, at least in the West, much so. Here, of course, there are diversity programs, but the term diversity may or may not be used. So even new positions such as Dean of Diversity and Inclusion are coming up in some campuses. APA, and I think the Physics Association also has set up committees, right, to look into issues of discrimination and propose constructive measures. Certain incentives such as scholarships are being introduced to pull in groups that are marginalized. And in India, of course, mechanisms have come up in the form of sexual harassment laws at the workplace, which is relatively new, right? And therefore setting up of internal complaint cell and so on and so forth to protect, to provide a safe working environment for women and minorities. So these are just a kind of some examples of measures, and there are a lot more. Now, what I am interested in is, and what I am actually trained to look at as a philosopher, is the way we frame the concept of diversity, right? And for us, framing and definitions become very important for two reasons. One is, of course, how a concept is framed is important to capturing aspects of things that are found on the ground. So that's the descriptive role. But what is more important is the normative part of things. So for instance, a concept is showing up in practice in a particular way. Diversity, let's say, is defined in policy in a particular way. But can we think of diversity in a better way, such that as the concept expands, or as the concept is modified or rethought, policy itself could also be influenced by that? And normativity is one of the fundamental one of the fundamental goals of philosophy. Because for us, even when we think about something like ethics or ethics of diversity, right? Ethics itself speaks to an ought and not an is. And it recognizes that there could be a gap between things as they are and things as they ought to be, right? So ethical standards are proposed so that they can be used to evaluate things that are right now and make it better. So a concept such as rights was actually a philosophical idea before the whole discourse of human rights came into operation. Before, the idea of rights is proposed in the context of a theoretical tradition called the social contract theory, and it is proposed at a time where there are no rights. There is nothing called rights that we identify as rights on the ground. And so rights becomes a philosophical idea that then can motivate us to think about our society, talk about problems of our society in new ways. So therefore, in this way, this is where the philosophers actually work. So I just wanted to put that out, that we are looking at some of the sort of stories of exclusion, etc. But what we are wanting to do is actually break into the concept itself and look inside the concept and put it in relation to other concepts and see what kind of possibilities show up. So it's essentially a kind of conceptual model building that we try to do. So my talk today is actually focused on this, and I'm still developing certain aspects of it, but a paper has come out in the Journal of Speculative Philosophy last year, which captures some of the things that I'm going to talk about today, and then I'm further provide some further pointers from that. And again, the focus on the normative will be very central. Okay. All right. So in a couple of slides, I will outline the main argument. So what I want to argue is that most of the discussions on diversity, as we see showing up, both at the theoretical level as well as policy-oriented level, actually takes diversity as a matter of composition. And I will break this down, what I mean, in a little bit. And I want to say that when we think about the concept of diversity, that's one kind of model, that's possible and that's necessary, actually. It's a necessary condition. But there is another approach which I propose in terms of the idea of poise. And again, this concept is something I'm going to develop in the course of the talk. And what I want to argue is basically that these two, in some way, these could be thought of as two different models that need to be integrated. Both are individually necessary, but they're only jointly sufficient for creating a sustainable culture of diversity. That's the claim I want to make. And therefore, diversity policies ought to integrate both these aspects. And when I look at model 1, I tend to argue that that model is mainly focused on resources and distribution of resources, whereas model 2 brings in the question of responding to diversity that is present. Again, and these are things that I will explain and break down. Okay. So in the structure of the talk today, therefore, first part we'll talk about composition, then we'll move on to poise, and from poise I will basically move towards an ethics of diversity, and as an aspect of the ethics of diversity, I will talk about one thing today, which is about building diversity competence. But there could be other sort of ways in which we can think about expand on the ethics of diversity as well. Okay. So, diversity as composition. Now, the most widely acknowledged aspect of diversity in institutional context pertains to composition. From the perspective of composition, I think the fundamental question that diversity is concerned with is one of adequate representation of difference, of things that are not there, right, of the non-hegemonic. The goal of adequate representation, I argue, is to create a certain visibility of difference. So something is homogeneous, and with diversity policies, you bring difference into that space. So it's an appearing of difference with which it is concerned, this model. And visibility can be created through quantitative measures, such as increasing the number of representatives from underrepresented groups at various levels, increasing number of courses, so diversifying the curriculum, right, to reflect standpoints which haven't been there before. Again, certain qualitative measures can be taken, like reorganizing campus infrastructure, so that, let's say, buildings are more disability friendly, so things like that can also factor in. So these are kind of where the focus is in the composition model. And it has immense significance. And when we want to see whether an institutional space is diverse or not, absence of composition immediately implies absence of diversity. If there is no difference that is appearing in that space, of course that space is not diverse. Right? However, philosophically, I think the interesting question to ask is visibility of difference once difference appears in a space understood in terms, and here visibility is defined in terms of adequate representation, is this a sufficient condition to infer the presence of diversity? We understand it's a necessary condition because its absence means the absence of diversity. A quantitatively non-diverse group is not diverse. But
I understand correctly, in visibility of difference, you are suppose I take the model of NCRE, you are taking, say, number of female faculty members, number of Hindu faculty members, Muslim faculty members. You're also taking whether this thing has elevator.
Exactly.
It has. So these are the composition.
Exactly.
And now you are saying whether these are enough.
It
includes the number of female students. And
absolutely, absolutely. It's a representation, right? So how is representation? How is difference showing up in the space? Difference could show up in the demographics. Difference could show up in the structure of spaces, as in the case with, let's say, disability-friendly buildings, right? Or it could first show up in course content, which would apply more to certain subjects than others. But again, so all these would be a kind of thing that I'm calling visibility. Okay, from the point of view of the question, what I want to argue, that the presence of adequate representation is very important. So composition is absolutely important. But the problem is that we get stuck here. And I think that, and I will come to this, that creates actually very specific quandaries or dilemmas for people that are different in that space, because we don't move the conversation beyond composition. And so therefore I want to conclude that the presence of adequate representation is only a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for presence of diversity. So simply by saying, for instance, numbers, we cannot conclude that the space itself is diverse. I think the composition model can actually target some of the more common nodes of exclusion that I had laid out in the previous two slides. For instance, how many people of different demographics are there, right? That can be targeted through the composition model easily. Now in philosophy, and again, I cannot get into an elaborate definition, but when we talk about theories of justice, there are different models that are offered. Some models focus on distributive concerns. So they think the problem of injustice arises because of some sort of unfairness in distribution. And it could be distribution of material goods, like wealth, or it could be distribution of non-material goods, like rights. Okay? So there are distributive models of justice. So Marxism would be, for instance, a distributive theory of justice, because it's talking about changing the pattern of economic distribution. Yeah? But there are also models that talk about non-distributive issues of justice and say that distribution can only capture certain aspects of injustice and therefore can solve the problem of injustice only to a limited extent. So even when we talk about material goods or non-material goods, there are aspects that are non-distributive. So for instance, the question of when we talk about power, it's not simply if you give powerless more power. And first of all, it's very difficult to talk about distribution for non-material goods. What does it mean to cut up power? You cannot really do that. But secondly, power also means the ability to act. And that ability also then depends on a lot of other factors that have nothing to do with distributing power. Right? So empowerment therefore becomes a more complex thing. Right? So distributive justice is one way of thinking about justice, and I think the composition model can target that quite effectively in certain cases, especially when it's the material goods we are talking about. So let's say the distribution of positions there or distribution in student intake. Right? So there it can target it better. But what becomes more difficult to solve through the distributive model, I think, is questions about, like I said, non-material goods, as well as things like privilege, oppression, and structural injustices. So these are all non-distributive kinds of issues that, by virtue of belonging to a social group which is marginalized, when you come into an institutional space where you are maybe the one or two people that are there, do you succumb to other injustices? Such as, for instance, can you be stereotyped negatively? Can the burden of diversity-related work fall on you disproportionately? These sorts of things are not necessarily a distributive aspect, right? These actually can impact how people look at themselves, what kind of confidence they feel, how they actually become practitioners of their disciplines, right? So these then actually tie to much deeper questions than an issue of distribution. Moreover, there are other injustices which I'll talk about in a little bit, but epistemic injustice, for instance, so epistemology is the field of philosophy where we talk about, it's a theory of knowledge, it's the domain which is theory of knowledge, where we talk about how people know what counts as knowledge, what counts as justification, what counts as truth, so on and so forth. Yeah? So if I am marginalized in a particular space, does that affect me as a knower? Becomes an issue. And there's a lot of elaborate literature on epistemic injustice, which is difficult to get into in non-technical language, but whether knowledge production, it affects knowledge production in a particular way, it actually impacts the practitioner as a knower in a particular way. These are concerns that will fall within discussions of epistemic justice or injustice. And those again cannot be thought in terms of typical economic injustice or social injustice. This is a very different kind of injustice that's happening. So I think if we look at these elements, then we actually need to understand that these two are very important to create a sustainable culture of environment, of diversity in the long run. Because otherwise what could happen is either the lives of those people or their capacity to perform or other aspects of themselves can be adversely affected. And this actually, again, in philosophy has resulted in people leaving the discipline, seeking positions in other departments, and so this is how it has affected specifically our field. So I think this is the limit of some of the limits of the model of composition. And so therefore I argue that for a quantitatively diverse group of people to become diverse to the fullest extent, and for realizing the goals of diversity in a sustainable fashion, changes in other things, changes in terms of orientation or poise is also required. And then I'll go on to introduce what I mean by poise. Now, when we were talking about composition, again, we are mainly talking about distribution of resources, right? Through positions, through scholarships, through things like that, yeah? But I think what is very important to actually build in an idea of how an institution or members in an institution respond to the difference that they find visible. And that actually brings in a dimension that doesn't directly, that cannot be reduced to composition. Yeah? And so therefore, the moment we bring in response, we also bring in discussions about how we ought to relate to others who are different from us. How ought an institution deal with members that are diverse, right? So this ethical question comes into the picture there in a very different kind of way, because ethics has to do with our relation to others and how we understand them. So therefore, poise is basically defined as a kind of response, and both on the part of the institution as a whole and members in it. Yeah? And it involves primarily two things that I'm going to talk about. One, I'm saying difference is visible before me. How do I orient myself? How do I poise myself towards that difference such that it becomes present in a more substantial sense? And I use a different term here because I think visibility does not capture the full extent of what is required there. Also, we need to think about how, as members of, whether it's academic communities, professional bodies, members of disciplines, right? How we understand our relationship to the community, to the institution that we inhabit. And this becomes important because academic institutions, how we understand academic institutions is going to play a role there. Or how we understand disciplinary space becomes important there. Institutions are framed in very different kinds of ways. So contractarianism and communitarianism are two approaches, but let me speak about contractarianism in a very simple way. And this language is becoming very, very sort of prominent globally today, right? That you pay for your education and you know, it's a good that you buy on the market, and teachers are teaching you produces you the consumer. So the contractarian model basically centers all discourse on the individual and tries to talk about institutions as serving something that the individual desires or individual wants. So the individual becomes central there, and a certain give and take relationship is what you understand by your relationship to the institution that you're there. In a communitarian approach, it will go the opposite extreme, which will say communities come first and individuals are individuals only by virtue of their membership in communities. And I think both these approaches to understanding academic institutions become problematic. So redefining how we understand academic institutions, I think, is important. I want to put forward an understanding of academic institutions as communities, not simply associations, but as communities, and specifically as communities of hope and memory. And I'll come to this again in a little bit. Now, what is important is that when we are doing all of this, we are actually then getting into different fields of philosophy. We are asking questions about the relationship of part to whole, right? I as a member am part of an institution, which is the whole, right? So the part-whole relationship has to be worked out logically. What is the logical representation of that relationship? How do I understand myself? What is the self in relation to a larger whole? These are questions that would fall within ontology, right? So these sorts of different domains have to be addressed. And here again, I am not getting into the particular theories I'm working with, because that is very difficult to communicate in non-technical terms. But my analysis is grounded in a tradition called idealistic pragmatism, which also takes semiotics to be important. And semiotics is a theory of science, But anyway, so I'm not getting into that thing, but hopefully I can still make some of the main points. So what I've argued here, that visibility is necessary but is not reducible to presence. Presence is a higher order concept, right? And so now we have to think about what does presence demand. And let's think about what presence demands at a level of the individual. When I want, as an individual moral agent, right, or an individual member of a community, I want to respond to difference in a productive way. What do I need to do? So let's begin in a very simple way in terms of looking at visibility. When we are talking about perception, for instance, we are passing a lot of different things on the road every day. We are, a lot of things become visible, but only certain things stay in our memory, or only certain things we actually attend to, maybe because it annoys us. If there's a roadblock, then we pay special attention to that road, right? Otherwise, we might not even notice that we are walking there because we walk through that every day. So a certain embodied engagement, right? My body responding to things in a particular way, speaking to it in a particular way, because I'm interested in it, or I intend to look at it, right? So if I am, I'm a botanist and I'm walking by and I see a flower which is new, I might tend to attend to it, whereas another person might not. So therefore, things become present to us relative to an interest, with reference to a certain purpose and within a specific context. Everything visible will not be present in that way. So, but visibility in an important sense impacts presence, influences presence, because we normally tend to choose between things that are already visible to us. If I hadn't passed by that flower, I wouldn't have stopped to see it, right? So there's an important role that visibility plays there. But presence is a stronger term. So in making something visible, much less is required than in making something present to myself. So the institutional motivation to promote diversity in the sense of composition perhaps rests on a desire to build a robust visibility for the concept within an institutional space. Now, while recognizing this, again, it has its limitations. And I think a productive, therefore, poise brings in the dimension of this kind of immediacy, right? That for the botanist, that flower is immediately present in a way that is not for me, because I actually don't know many flowers. So I won't attend to it, right? So there's an immediacy. So my body, and body is a space of meaning making, right? It immediately responds to it in a very different way. So, it's important to recognize that while a lot of things are rendered visible at the individual level, either directly or indirectly, the visibility of an entity in and of itself does not guarantee that an individual will actually take that reality to be a part of itself, right? Will actually morph itself around it. So I can actually build a memory of that day based on the flower I encountered, in a way that somebody who does not care about flowers will not, right? So, so it requires a kind of agency. It requires some kind of active orientation on my part, and it involves a particular response in my part. So here actually, I cannot go into details of it. This comes out of a conception in idealistic pragmatism about the self. So what is the self? The self is defined as a kind of life plan, which basically means that, a human life becomes a self, I become myself, through a plan of life that I live out for myself. So this is a kind of more process model of the self that is there. And agency, what is interesting here is that agency is always is defined in a very specific sort of way. Agency means that given a situation, and a range of possibilities, we must take a cut. We must make a cut in order to act. So agency typically has been understood in terms of choice, for instance. I am an agent because I have the ability to choose. These people are saying that no, that's not what all there is. Agency demands certain action. In order to act, you have to make a cut in the world. You see possibilities before you, but you have to make a cut and you have to decide whether you're going to stop by the flower or not stop by the flower, right? And this actually ties in with a big discussion that is there in logic about whether when we are doing logic, are we actually just, is logic simply a formal system of order? Is it a formal science of order? Or can you talk about agency in logic? So here actually Bertrand Russell and Josiah Royce have a debate. And Russell says that no, it's mainly, the logical entities. Logic is a science of order, and the logical entities are representations of things, right? And the pragmatist idealists are saying no, logic is actually a science of order. It's actually a way of building a series. And logical entities are not things; they are actually modes of action. And so there's a debate about whether logic implication is the fundamental logical relation or exclusive disjunction is the fundamental logical relation, which we don't need to get into. But the idea is that every act of agency involves discrimination, which involves making a choice and foregrounding certain elements of a situation and backgrounding others. And the moment you make a cut and you choose one direction, it means the other is also closed off to you. Okay? In the terminology I've been setting up so far, we could say that not all things that are visible end up becoming a part of my life plan or my life world. It is only acts of agency embodied in moments of choice which ends up converting visibility into presence. That's where agency comes very importantly into the picture. It's a kind of lived relation with a thing that is visible to me. And so therefore the moment it becomes present to me, it changes from being simply out there to something which is part of my world. Now, so there's a certain change in orientation that we find, which is the change from visibility to presence. In visibility, a thing is still out there, I can still see it, but I can pass it by, right? And I may not even remember it the next moment. In presence, it actually impacts me at a different level, and it becomes a part of my world, fundamentally. I'll come to in a little bit as to how then this becomes important for diversity. But acts of agency first and foremost change the agent, right? Choice then generates an ideal in the light of which my actions now gain meaning, right? And therefore now how does it impact us? When we are talking about individual and community relations, right? Agency of individual members will actually impact the agency of an institution in some ways. See, and I want to actually stress on this point because a lot of times institutional agency, the term institutional agency, is used in a very vague way, right? Oh, there are these policies that are on the books. But I am not personally responsible for those policies, unless the institution tells me to, in some way, right? So there is no sort of, there is no sense that actually institutions are produced through individual members, right? And then individual members, again, are shaped through institutions, right? And so there's always a dynamic relation of co-constitution between the two. And I think this is what both the communitarian and the contract model leaves behind. So community, therefore, if we think of academic institutions as communities, right? Communities become dynamic interactive spaces in which individual wills shape the social will, which is the institutional will, and vice versa, Also, community becomes the product of interpretation. So community is not something static and given. Right? I come in as a member of an institution that is already there. But when I leave, the institution actually takes in a part of me. Right? So there's a way in which, and this is again goes back to the way logic is conceived there. So it's very interesting that how through the self-will an ordered series is generated. And this model is then mapped onto thinking about a community. Right? The community is composed of these individual self-wills which get their meaning through the institution, but at the end of the day, the institution also is shaped through these wills. So therefore, individual and collectivism are actually tendencies that grow hand in hand. You cannot say one trumps the other, or my agency is not important because the institution will take care of of things. So. Okay. The other important thing that actually shows up is this idea that if this is the case, if we actually think about the, so to say, the metaphysics or the reality of a community in this way, then community also becomes the product of a time process. So individual members are, when we enter any community, including academic communities, there are certain protocols, rules, ways in which that community defines itself. Right? And then through which I actually understand my position in it. So there is a certain past or certain memory that is carried forward, which is then carried into me. But communities, and therefore, through new members, communities also carry a hope of something that could be different, that is not there. Right? So it's a time process, there's a temporal ontology, there's temporal reality to how a community is constructed. And if this is the case, then the question, then it means that poise of an individual contributes to the reflective and narrative processes of both the individual and the community. So how I poise towards difference is not simply my own matter, but it actually, it makes us hopeful that it can actually impact the community in the long run, even after I exit it, right? So, therefore, if poise contributes to the narrative process of both individual and communities, then difference in poise will actually make a significant difference to how a community is written into existence. So the community, two or three points I want to convey. Community is not a static entity. Community is something that's evolving. It's a temporal process. There is a co-constitution of self-will and individual will. And that actually helps us thicken an understanding of my agency, what I can do with relation to diversity policies, as well as then how it impacts institutional agency in the process. So, academic communities, I want to argue, let's maybe look at academic communities as communities of hope and communities of memory. It's not simply a community which is focused simply on training and teaching and research, but it actually, these are spaces where these can become new spaces of hope and new spaces of memory in the lives of people that inhabit it, whether it's students, whether it's faculty, whether it's researchers. So the specific way in which the individual community relation is worked out helps us to then thicken a conceptualization of institutional agency. If, and this is very important because institutional agency sometimes is articulated through various policies and protocols, let's say through conduct protocols, protocols of conduct, decisions about hiring, student recruitment, campus resource development. That's how an institutional agency usually manifests itself. While the collective energies of its members are required to articulate policies and protocols, the policies themselves transcend the choice or actions of any individual member of that community. However, the phrase institutional agency should not be allowed to become a placeholder for a vague sort of agency. which it often becomes, that, oh, the institution will take care of the problem, what can I do? So institutional agency can become a placeholder for a vague moral agency that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But this understanding of institution as a community, and specifically communities of hope and memory, actually pushes us to also think about our own responsibilities in the context of institutional diversity. And partly what Poise is demanding is that there is a certain, it's not simply, it's not, if difference is visible, one way to deal with it is actually to say, is to tolerate it, right? And tolerating it means that you need not engage with it at all, right? You mean that, okay, there is this person now who's hired to do this work, right? And that solves the problem of diversity. So for instance, if you're talking about curricular diversity, specific kinds of research we do, you hire a person who can now teach women thinkers. And so the problem of diversity is taken care of, because then nobody else in the department need to first carry on that labor, and secondly, they need not actually think about it also, because now it's taken care of, right? So tolerance itself, I think, is a very insufficient response to the problem of pluralism, because tolerance doesn't actually mean that we are questioning ourselves, right? Or we are actually critiquing the difference. We're taking difference to be very innocent. We are not thinking that there could be hierarchies in it, right? That difference is not just a matter of you being different from me, but hierarchically, things and people and material on the curriculum could actually be in a hierarchy, where some are perceived to be more important and others less important, right? So there can be a very vague moral, as ethicists we are concerned, that there could be a very vague moral relativism, that your truth is yours and I don't interfere with you and you don't interfere with me, right? And that does nothing to change or raise fundamental questions about disciplines and methods and so on and so forth. That does nothing to pluralize anything, is my concern. So on the contrary, what is needed is a direct kind of interaction, confrontation with this difference, such that then new things can evolve from there, right? It's not simply the old things and the new things are added in a very additive manner, but there should be a more interactive interaction between worlds of thought, worlds of knowledge, by which agents are actually willing to change as knowers. And that is very important, because otherwise people who are doing that diversity related work, it creates a very unsustainable environment for them. It creates a very unhealthy environment for them. And even when it comes to not just faculty but students, right? Simply if we attend to composition, then people come, get stereotyped, confront a lot of hate, and there are a lot of mental health issues and other issues that actually arise, right? So, therefore, I want to argue that in order to sustain this kind of diversity in the long run, we actually need to create more sustainable environments which are not simply focused on tolerance, but we actually need to cultivate a robust ethics of diversity in the space. And ethics of diversity is not simply a question about putting difference there, but actually teaching people to also live with that difference and work with that difference. So there's certain training that needs to be in place. And this is where some of the controversial claims come into the picture, because the ethics of diversity ought to focus on building what I call diversity competence. And so the last part of the talk basically focuses on diversity competence. And by diversity competence, I mean a very specific, the kind of ethical poise towards difference that I have described. And one of the things that is involved is to convert visible difference into presence. And I think this doesn't come naturally. There is training that is required to do that, even for the well-intentioned, even for those of us who want to cultivate or work for diversity. And the problem is, and again, I think a lot of, I would like to know, I haven't had an opportunity to study the Indian context very closely as yet, but in the academic context of the US, for instance, a lot of the diversity policies actually are geared towards integration of those that are different into mainstream institutional life. For instance, there are programs for improving language skills of non-native speakers of English, right? There are special orientation programs that some of us have been through for international students, right? Then there are resources that are given, like additional tutoring, etc., for first-generation college goers or people with learning disabilities. So there are so all these initiatives are very good, they're very commendable. But the problem, I think, is that the goal is to basically facilitate better integration of members that are considered to be different into the institution, right? That's the goal. Now, while such initiatives are important, I worry that a narrow focus on members of primarily marginalized groups within a given institutional context is not enough to build a holistic culture of institutional diversity. I think that efforts at building diversity competence must also bring within its purview members of the dominant groups within any institutional context. And that's very difficult, but that's actually what creates sustainability, I think, will create sustainability in the long run. So by dominant groups, I mean the group that either is numerically dominant or symbolically hegemonic, or both, right? So it could be majority in terms of numbers, or it could be a minority, but according to whom norms of professionalism, etc., are defined, right? So building diversity competence within this demographic is equally, if not more, necessary for creating a lasting culture of diversity and changing the overall institutional poise towards diversity. And part of the task of fostering an ethics of diversity and building diversity competence in individuals that appear to fit institutional norms is to elicit a response of critically analyzing difference and putting oneself in relation to this critique. And therefore, what is important is to focus also on privilege and not just marginalization in diversity policies, right? Because privilege and marginalization always work hand in hand. They are both related terms. And if marginalization is to be remedied, that automatically means that privilege needs to be undone. Otherwise, no structural change can happen. So discourses around privilege need to also come into the picture in a very robust way. There's a reason for making this recommendation, because I think that it is important to prevent the interest and effort at diversity from solely becoming the burden of the people that appear different, or those that appear to do diversity-related work. Right? For instance, through teaching, through research, through service in relevant administrative committees, right? Through recruiting students from certain neighborhood. I mean, all these could fall within diversity work. In this scenario, not only does the burden of actual labor, the burden of work related to diversity becomes unequally distributed, this can be thought of as a distributive injustice I was talking about, right? That the labor is disproportionately divided between people who want to work for diversity or are perceived as working for diversity. But more importantly, I think they actually increase the moral and the epistemic burden on those people, in the sense that the burden to justify, the burden to know about diversity also falls disproportionately on these people, right? So there's a certain, so there are issues of division of labor then that come into the picture. There are issues of cultural imperialism that will come into the picture. And more importantly, the sense of self can be undermined in the process. Not just overwhelmed, but also undermined in the process. Because if one is constantly, oneself and one's work is constantly in the process of requiring justification due to being different in ways in which the work and the selves of privileged members are not, then symbolic and structural inequalities will continue. Right? So there's a kind of epistemic injustice, there's a kind of ethical injustice, and there's a kind of ontological injustice as well, along with the disproportionate division of labor. Without, therefore, part of the task to improve institutional poise towards diversity and a part of the ethics of diversity is to raise broader questions regarding problematic standards of visibility, hearing, and justification within any given institutional context. Elements which might be causing asymmetry and inequalities in composition to begin with. See, we begin with the problem of composition, that there is no difference. But what we fail to actually question is, why is there no difference? What are the structural conditions because of which there is no difference to begin with? Right, and so if we simply try to focus on composition, then these larger, deeper conditions are not remedied. And so composition ratios can later also be skewed up again and again, right? So, so this is important, and I also want to talk about, just one last thing. Actually, when I started thinking about some of these things, I had a position at Oregon State, and Larry Roper was one of the administrators there. And so he had done some interesting work from a university administrator's point of view on focusing on students' responses to campus diversity. So he did a lot of studies which tried to calculate how do students respond to diversity policies. And he found that, so he studies and synthesized student responses, and his study revealed something very interesting, that there is often a difference in the phenomenological experience of campus diversity between students from underrepresented backgrounds and those belonging to groups that have historically been at the center. So the experience of diversity policies was actually different on the two groups. The groups that were historically on the side of privilege and well represented, and groups that were underrepresented. He points out that the connection, for instance, between diversity and safety might be experienced differently, depending on whether students see themselves as being treated as members of hegemonic groups or non-hegemonic groups. And this is very interesting that he found from his study. In other words, there are several anxieties about diversity, and some students raise the concern that diversity could have negative connotations on their lives, if not handled responsibly. And reporting on this, Roper writes, and I'm quoting him here, they, meaning students, want us to be committed to diversity broadly defined, but they want us to do it in a way that helps them feel safe. And again, the safety and diversity connection was being experienced in different ways. That's what he found. Then he further writes, students want to be able to look at our actions and know that all students matter. And this is a very interesting sort of thing to consider, right? I mean, what are they trying to say there? And I think that some of the anxieties that Roper finds in his study, especially on the part of members of historically privileged groups, and this anxiety was mostly from people that were well represented, right? Are partly an outcome of focusing primarily, if not exclusively, on compositional aspects of diversity without significant attention to the ethics of diversity. So there is no training, there's no way in which the people that were at the center could tune themselves to understanding that diversity that's there, and what does it mean or why and how. They had no clue. They just thought that there is a bias that's created, right? Because diversity policies are in operation, which is, I think, a common response that might come across different contexts. And my point is that, after all, a certain degree of diversity competence is required in order to understand, appreciate, and somehow even grasp the significance of the representational aspects of diversity. Why diversity? Why does it matter? And nobody talked to students, for instance, about this, and neither to faculty or staff, right? We know that there are policies that are there. So, I think in an absence of clear perception and understanding of the needs and contours of diversity in the life of their institutions might end up causing animosity between members perceived to be different and those perceived to be hegemonic within a given institutional context. So this kind of difference in response also actually factors into the fact that there could be animosity created, hatred created between these two groups. And therefore, I think building of diversity competence should be a concerted effort of the whole community, which should involve working through difficult conversations and issues such as oppression and privilege, difference and hierarchy, center and margin, and questions such as diversity for whom, why, and how. Finally, I think the question of diversity for whom is very important to raise for diversity measures to be successful. This question directs us to the question of power and warrants a critical analysis of existing power relations within an institutional space. Not only could experiences of diversity be different depending on differential group membership, as Roper's study points out, but expectations from diversity policies could also differ significantly. For instance, having an opportunity to learn French or German as a second language in college could be a hallmark of a multicultural curricula for a white Anglo speaker. Right? And the institutional mandate for a second language requirement can be seen as a diversity initiative, that you're being asked to learn a second language. But for the same initiative could end up having a very different meaning and resonances for, say, a Latina speaker from the global south, where the existence of only French and German in the curriculum means that still the focus is on the global north and not on the global south, right? So from the perspective of one group of students, it's still, see how diverse the curriculum is, because now we are learning about Europe and we are in the US. But for this group, that's not the case, right? So since the experience of diversity as well as knowledge and resources for handling it might be different, and this is the last slide, depending on the position of an individual member within the current schema of institutional and social power, significant latitude should be allowed as far as the kinds of activities required for building diversity competence at any given point of time are concerned. These measures may even change over a period of time in response to changing context and needs, right? So that those have to be tracked as and when implemented, and we should allow for certain latitude there, and they can be flexible. While recognizing the issue of latitude, my intention is nevertheless to bring attention to the fact that the building of diversity competence is critical to long-term goals of institutional diversity, and all members, not only some members, must be brought within its fold. The labor and the ethical burden cannot and should not only be the concern of those who appear different and or those who are perceived as doing diversity-related work in an institutional setting, nor should agency be diffused or rendered meaningless in the name of a vague institutional agency. Diversity as a goal gradually comes to fruition and gains concrete shape and definition within an institution with the gradual development of proper institutional poise towards diversity. Its sedimentation in the life of a community on a long-term and sustainable basis depends equally on structural reorganization and the practice of its members. And poise actually targets this part of praxis. Qualitative and quantitative measures together can reorient the energies of an institutional space such that a holistic culture of diversity can be created in the long run, and diversity can become a dynamic principle in the community's life. Institutions of higher learning, conceptualized as communities both of hope and memory, and spaces of critique, are perhaps best poised to initiate such experiments in diversity. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. Sorry I took a little longer than...
We can have a discussion.